Yeah, thanks. That was a great introduction. Yeah, so about 36 years of intelligence community work and 24 and a half years with the Navy. So I get bored easily, so I had 2 jobs at the same time.
But you asked a lot of good questions.
Yeah. In the reserves, where I retired from in 2010, I retired from the federal government in 2016. Everybody thinks that it's just 1 weekend a month and then a couple weeks each year for active duty for training, but that ain't right. I'm here to tell you, I got the scars from it. It's more like 3 weekends a month, especially when you're a commanding officer, which I had 2 CO tours as a reserve guy. You're always looking after the kids. Something stupid always happens, you know. So you're in the people business and getting the mission done. And one other little anecdote about the reserves too. The most fun I had there was as the backup J2 Director of Intelligence for U.S. Forces Korea. And the whole deal there is on the peninsula. The idea was that the active duty forces got smoked in the early volleys, you know, especially with chemical or biological or nuclear weapons, which is potentially going to happen. Then our job, we had a third of a cadre of a joint operations center that would roll in on the peninsula in the south and help retake the peninsula and end the war. You may know that there is no peace in Korea. It's an armistice. So there is still a state of war in existence there. And that's been going on since 1951-ish. So my job, along with some active duty cadre that rolled back to the south, and we had a third of our complement that were active duty folks coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan who were teaching us what they were learning in combat. And so we practiced 3 times a year for 3 weeks each how to retake the peninsula. And our job, we stayed in it for 5 years as Reserve and National Guard guys. And the active duty guys rotated every 18 months on unaccompanied tours. So they would forget things that we knew 5 years earlier. You know, by the time they'd rotate, they'd learn their job, and the new guy would come in, we'd start all over with them. So it's a very, very symbiotic and useful relationship with Guard and Reserve, along with the active duty forces, especially for Korea. And it's looking more like the Indo-PACOM AOR is going to be the next one to go hot. So got some war stories there. Also, I want to come back at the end of my talk to a little bit of a war story that relates back to the Constitution and its importance and its value. When I was a civilian in an intelligence community, 3-letter agency, my job was Director of Military Support. I was responsible for worldwide deployments of our youngsters who were embedded with combat forces in Southwest Asia, in the Philippines, some other places, to make sure that our product, which is basically from spy satellites and navigation, digital mapping, targeting materials, stuff like that, that directly supported combat, that our teams throughout those AORs, areas of responsibility, were well equipped, they're well supplied, they're well trained, and they were engaging directly with their counterpart combat forces, helping them be more discriminate and targeted well in enemy action. There's a place I went with, I had 2,000 kids deployed. I was responsible for taking care of them, making sure they had the latest tools and training and equipment throughout the whole Southwest Asia AOR, in a place that sounds a lot like Afghanistan. But I signed a piece of paper that said I wouldn't say I was there. So I can't tell you the exact name of the country. But I'll come back to that at the end of my talk and share with you something very personal to me about fallen heroes who defended our Constitution. And I want you to take that thought home with you. But in the meantime, let's talk a little bit about the Constitution. Next slide. Thank you. So we've heard a lot about, you know, we've got a democracy. Save our democracy, etc. Well, technically, and I'm here to tell you, we do not have a democracy. We have a constitutional republic. A little different, okay? And we chose it to be that way. Our founding fathers set it up that way. take a few of these bullets here. In the true sense, where democracy, all citizens had a say in everything all the time. Now, can you imagine what chaos we would have with 338 million people arguing with each other over, okay, which schools do we fund, who do we vote for, all this kind of stuff, right? So technically, that is not a democratic form of government. It is a republic. The best examples I could give you of true democracies were perhaps the ancient Athenian democratic organization in Athens. But even though each person, quote unquote, had a vote on everything that went on, they were limited to landowning males at the time. So that too was not really a true democracy. Maybe pirate crews of the 17th century. That's probably about as close as to a democracy as you're ever going to get. But sometimes it could have disastrous results. You know, if they voted a captain in, they didn't like something he or she did, and they'd vote him or her out. And that was usually a long walk on a short plank, right? So, the point here is, like in the 18th century, the founding fathers, when they constructed the Constitution, coming out of the Federalist Papers and some other things, they realized that it's just too complicated to have one person, one vote all the time on everything. So we have representatives that we vote into office to do our public business for us at all levels. Let's go ahead, next slide, please. Okay, and here we have fall colors. And it might be, I don't know, Gunnison River Gorge. Not sure what that is.
Beautiful place.
While we're getting technical assistance, let's talk about sovereignty for a minute in the Constitution, what the founders were trying to get at. So I wanted to have this be a little interactive, okay? So let's have a show of hands. How many of you think that you here today, right now, are sovereign in our form of government? I'm very worried about you. You are sovereign. The founders put this thing together, the Constitution, so that the citizens retain our sovereignty. We are the ones who have given the authority to our representatives to represent us in the daily doings of government. Next slide, please. Thank you for helping.
Sure.
Okay, next slide. Keep going. Okay, so think about this now. Since we're sovereign, we're the bosses, all of us, in our republic.
Amen.
Right? And we live in states. You've heard, if you were here in previous discussions, very good speakers talking about how the way the Constitution set up sovereignty in the states. And the states did not give up anything. They permitted the federal government to do certain things. And that's the whole point of the Constitutional Convention. So let's talk about the ideas that came to fruition in that Constitutional Convention, where they were born from the ideas from our Declaration of Independence. And that's the title of my pitch. Laddie told me I had to have a title. So I said, okay, how about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness?
Amen.
Okay, that's something that's very important to me, and I think to all of you too. So I'd like to spend the next, 45 minutes or so sharing ideas and listening to you guys on what your experiences have been through your careers and your lives with your families, your communities. Has our Constitution protected and enabled the aspirations of our Declaration of Independence for each of us to have life, liberty, and our own pursuit of happiness? And I'll give a couple of examples of things that I've personally been involved in as an intelligence officer, executing combat overseas against terror that goes right back to this idea. And also something that happened to my wife Jane and me at our home that didn't make me very happy. It didn't make me very liberated. but it didn't take my life. But it's also an issue that rolls back to the Constitution. So let's, before we get into that proof, let's go back and take a look at the Constitution and do a little primer. And I apologize to those constitutional scholars and attorneys in the audience, but some of us only saw this stuff in grade school. And unfortunately, a lot of high schools these days don't teach civics anymore. So think about that with your kids and your grandkids. And maybe take away from this Constitution Week a new fire in your belly to educate those kids on things they're not learning in school. Next slide, please. So just as a review, Article 1, the legislative branch at the federal level. Basically, it comes down to Section 8. These are the basic powers. It's a summarization of that. Raising taxes, boo, monster, boo, but they're necessary. Borrowing money, paying debts, regulating commerce among the states. Very important. Weights and measures. You know, we complain about taxes and federal regulations, but you know, probably you got too much right now, in my own personal opinion. But think about it. If you want to conduct business in this country and you want to do it fairly, it'd be kind of hard to do without weights and measures and some of the federal regulations that help us keep the playing field level. Coining money. So the individual states aren't supposed to be coining their own money. That would be chaos. How many of you have Confederate dollars at home, buried in the backyard, under a mattress? Yeah, okay. So no good anymore, right? So coining money at the federal level. Post offices and roads. So thank God for the Constitution, or we wouldn't have our postmistress here in Grand Lake, who every time I go in there, she tells me, "Get your damn wife off the damn internet." And she's got about 5 boxes. Yeah, Jane, where are you? Sophia, oh, there she is, okay. Yeah, they know me at the post office. Declare war. Some of you have been here for some of the other evening discussions, and we've gone over that with a fine-tooth comb with our speaker from yesterday, I think it was. Raise an army and a navy. So I wouldn't have had a part-time job if that wasn't in the Constitution. Provide for the seat of government, 10 square miles, Washington, D.C., District of Columbia. One of my favorite places to stay away from. Yeah. And prohibits the states from acting like their own country. Foreign policy, things like that. Even though you hear about governors going to China, making deals, right? Or governors going somewhere else, or sending National Guard guys over to Ukraine. And it's kind of interesting how that works out. Next slide, please. Article 2 sets up the executive branch. Let's spend a little time discussing, and I'd like to get a little audience participation here. Maybe we can have a runner with a mic if necessary, walk around. I hate to wait for Q&As at the very end. But let's talk about the Electoral College. Now, as a show of hands, how many of you think that when you vote in November for president, that you're actually voting for a president? Anybody? No. You're voting for electors. Yeah, because of the Constitution. You're voting for a slate of electors if you vote Democrat or you vote Republican. In this state, in Colorado, I believe it's the majority takes the winner. So all the electors, even though they may have come from the Democrat Party or the Republican Party, if the popular vote says one or the other, then the electors have to go with that popular vote. That's not true in all other states. Most of them do that. I think it's about 38 do that. Mike, do you know? 38 states that vote the total percentage of the presidential slate.
All the names in Nebraska.
Yeah, okay, so, all right, so 48. Okay, so let's keep going. Why did we build an electoral college? Why did the founding fathers think that was necessary? Yes, sir.
Gives small states an equal voice.
Yeah, right. So back then, there were urban centers like there are today, and they're mostly rural. So it was a concern that they came up with, a little math solution that said, well, let's do it by population density, and then they finally landed on the number of representatives, senators, and House of Representatives members that you had in the state would equal the number of electors that you have that could cast their slate for president. Now, there's another reason too. About the time that the Constitution was signed, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, you had major craziness going on in France. It's when the French Revolution was really starting to build up a head of steam, and massive amounts of mob violence, crowd behavior, and I think it might have kind of freaked out our founding fathers looking at that and saying, well, we don't want the tyranny of a mob pushing a particular partisan answer towards who is going to preside over our executive branch for the next 4 years. So they reasoned that by having each state come up with responsible adults who had a vested interest in stability and growth, that an electoral college would be the best way to choose our president. And that's still the way it is today. And I'm sure you've read lots of articles or heard news pundits about, well, we got to change the system. You know, it's not fair, and it's not a direct election. But that's what we've got, and the magic number, a little over half, 270 out of currently 538 electoral college votes will win the day. Now, if there's a tie, remember we had an issue remember the hanging Chad issue that went to the Supreme Court with Baby Bush when he made president the first time. There's Daddy Bush and Baby Bush, right? And I worked for both of them. I've got some war stories for you later, maybe over coffee or something. So there are procedures in the Constitution from this article that talks about how the Congress will vote and work this out so that each state gets another shot at it if it's a tie. Now, also in this part of the Constitution, these last two bullet points talk about the oath of office, which is what today's theme was about with the veteran approach to that, where the president is required to take an oath of office from the Constitution that says he or she will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And recent history has shown that maybe there's a little bit of murkiness on that, but I'm not sure, how you solve those kinds of issues other than impeachment, and that didn't work. So I think it's kind of a jump ball. There's an evenly divided opinion in our country about the constitutionality of some of those events, like January 6th, for example. Some folks think it was a great expression of public display of unease with the whole process. Others think it was against the Constitution. It's really a matter of your personal opinion.
But Patrick, an interesting point, the presidential oath does not say anything to fight against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That's not.
That's correct. That's correct.
And so I guess he doesn't have to worry about that.
He or she, whoever the president might be.
Yeah, my pronouns.
But all the officers installed below that level, like when I was active as an SES and as a naval officer, I had to take the oath. I did it about 50 times throughout my career, just about every time I turned around. And my oath as an executive branch officer and official was very precise, and that I was bound to fight against all enemies, foreign and domestic, preserve and protect. Yeah, but the president's is a little bit more truncated. Now, this article empowers our president to make treaties with foreign countries, but with the advice and consent of the Senate. So there you see a little bit of the balance of power argument coming in when our founding fathers liked the idea of divided government, so you had checks and balances. So a treaty can't happen, can't go into force unless the Senate approves it. Appointing of ambassadors, ministers, heads of departments, judges, other officers, and thank God that I was in my career in the federal government, I worked very hard not to do too well, so that I was just below that political appointee level, Schedule C, where most of the bosses I worked for were political appointees, and they had to go through a very, very rigorous vetting process through the Senate. And it took months and an arduous process, but I helped them prepare for a lot of those things. But I was happy not to have to go do that. I was just below that level, and I was free to do what I wanted to do, pretty much. Let's go back to, hold on, you're going backwards. Okay, one more, please. One more. One more. Okay, next. Oh, whoa. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Article 3. Okay, judiciary branch. So those are the three branches of government, right? We have three branches. We got the legislators, the legislative branch. We got the president, the executive branch, and all the dudes and dudettes that work for him or her, like me. And Article 3, the judiciary branch. Now, I had to do a lot of studying because Laddie talked me into doing this. I hadn't really looked at a lot of this detail since grad school in 1984-ish. And it was really fascinating. You dive into this thing, and my attorney wife gave me a couple of her textbooks from constitutional law semester in her law school, and oh my God. If you ever, you don't need, what is it, melatonin? You don't need sleep aids. I have books for you, okay? Just come on over and borrow one, and I guarantee the lights will be out in about 10 minutes. All the history of Supreme Court cases and how, basically, what I learned from it, our culture changes with every generation. Our society changes with every generation. You go back to the founding principles in the Constitution, but then you look at, through the different epochs, different decades and centuries of our court system, there was some crazy stuff that went on. Oliver Wendell Holmes, some of the things that he ruled on were just outrageous by today's standards. Approving of sterilizing women who didn't behave correctly back in the late 1880s, crazy stuff that, just we would think is just horrible today. But over time, the judicial temperance changed with each of those generations, and our society evolved. But if you go back to Article 3, there are very, very few things said about how the Supreme Court is supposed to operate. For example, there are no term limits mentioned here. The closest thing I could find in the Constitution to a term limit is shall hold their offices during good behavior. What the hell does that mean? How do you define good? And what constitutes behavior? Official, private, public, both? Who knows? It's not in there. So it's all in the eye of the beholder and how things are considered in our current generation with our current legislators and, of course, the news media that, does the proctological exams on everything. Next slide. Article 4 talks about the states. I thought the interesting thing I picked up on this was this last one. Guaranteed every state in this union a Republican form of government. That doesn't mean the Republican Party as opposed to the Democrat Party. That means what I talked about at the very beginning. A representative form of government where the citizens remain sovereign, but they give that sovereignty and authority over to representatives who take and do their business for them, either in the state capitol or in the case of the federal government in Washington, D.C. And shall protect them against invasion. Hey, what's happening, huh? And domestic violence. It's in the Constitution. I had to go back and read it twice. And I was thinking, we've had some really interesting discussions about what constitutes invasion, what's going on right now with our southern border. So, there are things happening to us right now, folks, that if you go back to our founding document, we need to raise hell and make sure that our representatives are doing their job and that our justices are doing their job. Next slide. Article 5, 6, and 7, basically you read the words there, but it talks about, you know, how to change the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson apparently was very instrumental in this part. He had a saying of something, possibly misquoting here, but the idea was, we don't consider change for any transient or light means. It's got to be pretty darned important. So, very difficult to change the Constitution. 2/3 of both houses and 2/3 of the several state legislatures when ratified by 3/4 of the states. So, a lot of people have to get involved in order to make an amendment happen. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so James Madison. So I spent most of my adult life in Virginia. I was an Air Force brat though. I was born in Louisiana, moved all over different strategic air command bases, Japan, all over different darn places. But I spent most of my adult career in Virginia. Fellow Virginian James Madison brought up a lot of things from the Bill of Rights that we all learned about in grade school that ended up being about the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, but then there's some very important ones that followed that. The 13th, abolition of slavery. 14th, that gets into our theme, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No state may abridge the rights of citizens of the United States without due process. So that's where the federal government's coming in and telling Colorado, hey, you can't just throw somebody in jail just because you think they did something wrong. There's got to be a grand jury, there's got to be due process, there needs to be a trial, and so on and so forth. So that was because there needed to be evenly disseminated justice across the state. So the Constitution assured that with that amendment. The right to vote, 15th. And my wife will tell you the most important one, the 19th, women's right to vote. A lot of people complain about, the slavery issue and things are not fair here and there, but a lot of people forget that women were not treated very well or very fairly in our history, up to the point where things turned around with the 19th Amendment, and hopefully they will continue to get better in terms of parity. Now, let's talk about the oath of office. So Laddie kind of jumped my gun here a little bit, but thank you for that, Captain. I already talked about how I took the oath many times, and you can see the words there. That's the long version. It's kind of interesting. I did a little research on this, and it gets back to 1862 in the midst of the Civil War. There was an old oath from 1790, but it lacked the idea of domestic threats. Obviously, if you have an insurrection going on, which resulted in a civil war with 750,000 people dying in the United States, and all kinds of confrontation happening. After the fact, they kind of said, well, maybe in our Constitution we need to update the oath of office to include domestic enemies of the Constitution. There's a big debate back in Virginia about taking down statues of all these Confederates, right? My own personal opinion on that is you can't change history. History is what it was. We need to embrace it and learn from it. Now, at the same time, though, it's your alma mater, the United States Naval Academy, where I was an adjunct faculty member. I didn't think you knew that, astronomy professor. They made a big deal out of renaming Maury Hall, named after one of the most famous navigators in the United States Navy's history, and bathymetric scientist, incredible guy. But what did he do? When the Civil War broke out, he took that oath of office, right, to support and defend the Constitution as a naval officer in the United States Navy before the Civil War. But he couldn't leave his home state behind. Because remember, back in the Civil War era, about as far as you could go was 60 miles a day in a horse carriage or on a horse. People were local minded, not interstate minded like we are today, or not globally minded like we are today. Could we jump on an airplane and be anywhere in the world in 6 or 8 hours, right? Not back then. their country, what they thought of as their country, was their state, their community they grew up in. So a lot of these guys that swore an oath to the Federal Navy or the Federal Army, they booked when secession started, and they went with their home country, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, where they grew up, where their neighbors lived, where their families lived, where their ancestors were buried. But technically, that was a treasonous act. They gave up their oath, they took up arms against that Constitution, and they fought for the Confederacy. So that's one of the reasons the Naval Academy renamed Maury Hall. So there you go. That's a very emotional debate, and it really comes down to where you're from and what you believe. But that's what they did, what the Navy did. Let's go to the next slide. Now, talking about oaths to the Constitution. Let me give you a little history deep dive on this. Now, I happen to be an amateur ancient history buff. I've studied a lot about ancient Greece and ancient Rome. In fact, I have a book that I'll sell you, but that's not an issue for Constitution. Legionaries back in the Roman Republic days, before the time of the Caesars, when Rome was a republic. And by the way, a lot of our founding fathers took a lot of lessons from that Roman Republic up to about 40 BC, that time frame. Went back 400 or 500 years. When a centurion or tribune, the lead officers for voluntary armies that were formed from the Roman Republic, whenever their Senate believed that there was an existential threat, like, I don't know, Carthage, let's say, in the Punic Wars. By the way, do you know why there was no third Punic War? Anybody? Mike? They ran out of Punics. Yeah. Okay, so that's like a joke. No. Okay, so anyway, the centurion or the tribune would review the troops, and the troops all had their own armor that they paid for themselves. It wasn't state sponsored. And they would slam their fist into their chest at the strongest part of their armor. And they would yell out, "Integere" or "Integritas" in Latin, meaning it's strong, it's going to protect me, it's going to protect the Republic. And that was the oath that they took, that they recognized when their boss said, "Are you ready to go into battle?" They took an oath to the Republic, not to a person, not to a man, not to a Caesar, not to a president. It was an oath to an idea of the sanctity of the Republic and the Republican form of government that they were there to defend with their lives. That's where we get our word integrity from, by the way. A little fun fact there. Now, as these professional soldiers started to become more mercenary, they weren't just farmers who picked up their weapons and fought temporarily and then went back to farming or whatever they were doing as trade. But as the Roman Republic went through a horrible series of civil wars leading up to the era of Julius Caesar, and Caesar Augustus, who followed his nephew, who followed him, the oath changed. When the soldiers would get ready to go to war, they wouldn't say "Integere Republica." By the way, republic comes from Latin, res publica, for the people, or of the people. They would say what? "Hail Caesar," right? And then as that happened, they became more mercenary. There were hundreds of years of imperial expansion. But as the Roman Empire, under dictatorship, an autocratic dictatorship, failed and eventually fell, a lot of it had to do with these military forces saying oaths to a single man who would change pretty frequently, rather than to the idea of a republic. So our oath of office isn't to a president, it isn't to a member of Congress, it isn't to a Supreme Court justice. It's to the Constitution, the document that embodies the ideas of our republic. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. Well, I'm sorry, let's go back to this for a minute. I want to just underscore this. Let's look at the Nazi Germany thing here for a minute. So those of you who studied World War II, or anybody seen the movie Valkyrie? No? Yeah, a few of you? Okay, well, German officers, when Hitler came to power, they had to take an oath to Hitler, to him, not to the German government or not to the German people. And that caused some major problems down the road. In fact, that particular coup attempt, Operation Valkyrie, where German patriots in the government and in the military decided at that point that something had to be done, and they no longer abode by their oath to Hitler. They started working against Hitler on behalf of the German people in order to try to get some kind of a positive outcome for that nation state during World War II. So, should officers swear to the Constitution or to an individual? Constitution? Okay, good. So we're okay, Laddie. We did it right. And the Constitution, even though you may think it may have flaws, or you may think that there are flaws in how it's executed, that document has saved us from ourselves many, many times in our history. And as I pointed out earlier, our culture changes every generation. Our mores, our views of what right and wrong looks like, somewhat changes, but the basic tenets and basic principles are in the Constitution. Next slide. Now, we talked about enemies of the Constitution, foreign and domestic. Who knows who this guy is? Anybody? He was an American citizen. And I was kind of involved in this particular operation, so it's important to me. Let's go to the next slide. Anwar al-Awlaki. He was born in California, I think. He had Yemeni parents. He was a U.S. citizen, but he spent time in Yemen, where his parents are from. He went to school at CSU. Mike, come on. Yeah.
I didn't know.
You didn't know? Okay. Different year group. And this guy was smoother than silk. He was American raised, acculturated, but he was a radical Islamic imam. And he bridged the cultural gap between colloquial American culture and radical Islam. And he was responsible for several terrorist acts against the United States. So here's an American citizen who is supposed to have sovereignty and protections of our Constitution for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, his life didn't last very long. His liberty was severely impinged upon, and I think rightfully so, in my own personal opinion. And his pursuit of happiness was very dangerous for American citizens. He fomented a whole bunch of terrorist activities and operations. He was directly linked to being the propagandist for Al-Qaeda on the Arab Peninsula, AQAP, back in 2010. And our federal government placed him on the enemies list in 2010. So when we did that, when our president did that at the time, Barack Obama, right? Interesting guy. Briefed him once. Really, really smart. Asked really hard questions. Once he was on that list, did he lose his citizen's right to habeas corpus, the ability to have a trial by peers, by a jury, to be arraigned by a grand jury? None of those things ever happened. He put himself on this list by his actions, and 2 CIA Predator drones took him out with Hellfire missiles. in 2011 on the 30th of September. My agency that I worked for was involved in the targeting of that. So, but for me personally, I had to think about it for a couple minutes. No, wait a minute, this guy's an American citizen. I'm an American citizen. I guess I got to be careful about what I say, right? I should not be fomenting combat against my own population, my own country, which is what this guy did. And our president had no qualms at all of authorizing the strike. I mean, it was pretty immediate. So there are limits to liberty and free speech, the First Amendment. You know, Oliver Wendell Holmes is the guy who's famous for, you know, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire, because you're going to stampede a bunch of people, and that is the concept of social harm. When your own individual rights impinge on the rights of others, especially to their life, that's a problem. So there are limits to the articles, our guaranteed freedoms. In this case, this guy was severely limited, and you know, a lot of people found out about that pretty quickly. Let's go to the next slide. Now, that didn't stop there, though, with those hellfire missiles. There was litigation, and it referred to the constitutional rights that this American citizen should have had. But all of these attempts at relitigating the action and suing members of Obama's executive branch who were involved in the combat action. None of that stuck. The judge had some pretty interesting quotes. The fact is that Anwar al-Awlaki was an active and exceedingly dangerous enemy of the United States, irrespective of its distance, location, and citizenship, as evidenced by his participation in a Christmas Day attack. Anybody remember that, the underwear bomber that burned his butt instead of blowing up an airplane? Yeah, flying into Detroit, I think it was. And so on and so forth. He was able to persuade, direct, and wage war against the United States from his location in Yemen without being present on an official battlefield or in a hot war zone. That's a fact of life during the global war on terror. It was global. No kidding on that acronym, GWOT, Global War on Terror. It was all over the place. I told you I had 2,000 youngsters deployed all over the globe doing targeting support for our special forces going after these terrorists. The U.S. government moved against al-Awlaki as authorized by the defendants, that the officials acted in accordance with the authorization of use of military force enacted by Congress after the September 11, 2001 attacks. Those were authorizations to execute combat against terrorism after 9/11.
Patrick, was that related to the Patriot Act that was passed after 9/11?
I believe so. No, the Patriot Act did not rescind this, but it was not alluded to in the court case. So, how about, anybody remember this knucklehead U.S. Army Major Nidal Hassan, who killed a bunch of Americans down in Texas? He was proselytized and radicalized by al-Awlaki. Okay, so that's clearly a domestic danger, not just against the Constitution, but against our own citizens. That was an attack. Okay, next. Now, let's bring it a little closer to home, a little more mundane, but also on the theme of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And what are my constitutional rights to assure I have those things? Anybody know what that picture is? That is a plumbing fixture in the wall of my house that was newly constructed 2 years ago, about 10 miles south of here. My lovely, incredibly intelligent tax attorney wife, Jane, say hi, Jane, was downstairs in her office, her home office, and I hear this shriek, "Where the hell is all this water coming from?" And there we go. We had a cascade. We had an internal waterfall coming down through the walls of our beautiful new home. It took forever to figure out what the problem was. We finally dug into it. And this plumbing fixture, a brass fixture that connects plastic plumbing pipes together, PEX pipes. Anybody a plumber in here? Yeah? Okay, I got a good buddy who's a plumber. He said, just remember two things. You never, ever, ever have enough pipe, and don't ever bite your fingernails. Right? Okay. That's a plumber joke, guys. Okay. So, anyhow, that little crack right there on that brass fixture, I said, how does this happen? It's brand new. Brand new. And I got hundreds of them in my house, hidden back behind the walls. More cascades, Jan. We dug into it. Turns out the United States Congress passed a law directing the executive branch. So that's, remember now, this is a test now. Legislature, Article 1. Executive branch, Article 2. So we got the Constitution going on here. They passed a law directing the executive branch to initiate new standards for getting lead out of brass plumbing fixtures because kids were dying and having brain damage in Flint, Michigan because they couldn't fix their plumbing infrastructure. They had too much lead in their water system and these kids were suffering. So, in I think it was 2015, yeah, 2015 after Congress, they went crazy. Okay, no more lead in any brass plumbing fixtures. Instead, let's use copper. So copper was the other metal in the alloy to get to the brass for these fixtures. The unintended result of this was to create fixtures that would fail under pressure. Mine failed under pressure behind the wall, caused a lot of water damage to my brand new home, pissed off my wife, got me going crazy because juggling contractors in Grand County that's an art form, but it's really important. You gotta learn how to do that. And God bless them too, they came to our rescue. Turns out we got, we'll go back, an improved fixture, and then I started digging into it. Okay, so when's the class action suit gonna happen? Right? Ferguson Plumbing was going crazy with this because there were several incidents of this happening right here in Grand County just in the last 3 years. I was just one of the lucky ones. So you've got recourse from our Constitution as a citizen. I can raise hell, I can go talk to lobbyists that represent the plumbing industry and the fixtures industry and manufacturing and get them to put some pressure on the youngsters who are writing legislation. I used to be one of them as a congressional staffer, getting legislation to fix unintended goof-ups like this from the 2015 law and fix it. Now, when a federal agency is directed by the legislature to go do something new, to initiate a new regulation, guess what? There's a public comment period. Anybody know that? You, sovereign citizens, have the right, the obligation to keep track of that and say something. You have 30 to sometimes 90 days to comment on new regulations coming out if you think they're stupid or they're going to impinge on something you're doing with your business or your family or your life. We have that right. We have to exercise it. It comes from the Constitution. We can change the law and we can comment on how the executive is executing direction from the legislature per the Constitution. Next slide. Okay. Who likes paying taxes here? Anybody? He almost raised his hand. I paid $75,000 last year. I'm not happy about that. I'm not either. Yeah, neither is my spouse. But, you know, I hate paying taxes. But then I started thinking about it. Well, okay, so the Constitution calls for regulating interstate commerce, making things fair with weights and measures, one coinage of money. They have all kinds of actions directing the executive branch to go do stuff. Who here thinks one of the most important agencies in the United States government, everybody here has probably walked in here thinking, government's too big, we want to cut it down. I believe that somewhat. How many of you think the Food and Drug Administration is important? Do you eat? You eat food. Are you just trusting that it's not going to kill you when you put it in your mouth? How about your medicines that you take? So, you know, there are some good uses of federal regulation from our federal government to make sure that we are healthy and happy. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from the Declaration of Independence. So think about this. If you didn't pay taxes, you know, how you got to drive to City Market, or Mountain Market, or Sagebrush, or Charlie's, or Home Depot down in Denver, or, you know, Silverthorne or someplace. What if, you know, most of us think it's a right to get on an airplane and fly anywhere we want to, right? When's the last time you were at Denver International Airport? Anybody? Yeah. How'd you get there? Interstate highways, right? Who builds the interstate highways? I mean, you know, there are private companies that lay the asphalt and the concrete. Eisenhower, yeah. So, you know, there are valid reasons for having taxes and having federal regulation so that, you know, so if Colorado decided to stop the interstate 50 feet, you know, to the south, and Kansas wanted to put it 50 feet to the north, how are you going to get through Kansas? I mean, not that anybody really wants to go to Kansas, but, you know, sorry. Go Huskers, right? Yeah, by the way, anybody know what the N on the stands for on the helmets? Knowledge. Yeah, that's right. Okay. You gotta wait for it. Okay, everybody got it now. Okay, so look, you gotta have taxes, you gotta be able to go places, you gotta be able to live your life. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We've defined that as being multivariate in our modern society in the 21st century. And it comes at a cost. So maybe government's too big, but I can tell you when I was in the federal government, I got roundly criticized for closing offices and reducing budgets because my bosses, and some of them were political appointees, they say, well, don't you get it? You're supposed to add more money each year in the budget cycle. We got to grow, we got to grow. So, you know, we got to go after our money. I said, wait a minute, it's not our money. It's the citizens' money through taxes. And by the way, I don't work for you. I work for the American public, but I report through you. And when you start thinking like that, maybe we can get some things done. Okay? So maybe that's why I only ended up as an SES 3 instead of 4. But that's okay. But why is all this important? The Constitution and our basic rights and our sovereignty. And our need to understand what they are, to protect them, and to pass that on to the successive generations. Well, I've been all over the world. I have seen evil. I have fought against evil. Evil exists in the world. There is no doubt in my mind. There's some horrible things that happen outside our borders. You really have to travel outside our borders to appreciate what we have here in this country. And I am very concerned that our kids just don't get that. So anything you can do to instill this idea on your children and your grandchildren, please do it. But a lot of times it's kind of like the book Flatland. Anybody ever read that? From the 1930s? It's a political parody written by a mathematician. It's about a two-dimensional world, Flatland, where all the characters in the world were geometric figures, but they were two-dimensional. The hero of the story was a square, and he hung out with circles and lines and triangles. They're all his buddies. They go drinking. But he's very accident-prone. And one day he was in an accident, and he was propelled unexpectedly into the third dimension, away from Flatland. And he suddenly realized, hey, I'm a cube. I'm not a square anymore, I'm a cube. And he started hanging around with spheres and pyramids and cylinders and having a great time, but still being accident prone. He fell back to Flatland and suddenly was a square again. And he spent the rest of his life trying to explain to all the other two-dimensional figures how wonderful it was in the third dimension. So what they do? They locked him up. Locked him up. He was crazy. They had to reprogram him. He wasn't thinking like a Flatlander. So the point of my story is, it's kind of like living in Flatland. You got to get out there, travel the world, see what other polities, other countries are like, other civilizations, and their problems, to really experience the benefits that we have here. So once you're out there, you look back at your own country and your own life, you see how great we have it. And it all goes back to the Constitution. And our sovereignty. And our willingness to stand up for our rights and exercise our sovereignty through a democratic republic, through a constitutional republic. So that means vote. Vote your conscience. Talk to people. Get the word out, okay? That's why it's so important. So get out there, help me pass the word, evangelize our system of government to the youngsters, and make sure they don't screw it up. That's it. Thanks.
We have just a few minutes for a question and answer. Our next speaker has arrived. I'll let you handle the Q&A period. We're going to start setting up for the new speaker while you're answering questions. And come with me.
Yes, sir. Green cap.
I took the oath of office in Grand Lake 5 times. I took it very seriously. And to everybody who says, I'm just a citizen, there's nothing I can do, I would say, get involved. Maybe one of the most important things you can do, because of our future, get with school boards. Make sure they're teaching what you want them to teach.
Amen, brother.
A lot of areas can be part of. You don't have to be the main person, but get involved, because if you don't do it, it doesn't happen.
That's it.
Everybody hear that? Get involved, influence your school board, get them to teach civics. Those are the 3 bullet points.
Is it true that if you're in the military, you're not able to,
It's not going to read. Sorry.
okay. Is it true that if you're in the military, you are not able to espouse opinions about the city president politically?
Yeah, that's
I
right.
have a question about that.
Okay.
If they swear their oath to the Constitution, why is that the case?
Because he or she is the commander-in-chief and the senior executive of the federal government. So, I mean, you could mouth off about it, but you probably get fired the next day, right? So it's really up to the individual. But yeah, you swear an oath to the Constitution, not to the president.
Does the Constitution make it clear who can become a citizen and how, because we're about to have a bunch of people become citizens, maybe, and is there a way to undo that?
There is a naturalization clause in the Constitution that talks about citizenship. But we had a really good briefing on immigration and naturalization about 2 nights ago. And from what I heard from that briefing was that there is no specific citation in the Constitution other than the qualifications for running for president, that you have to be a citizen. Natural born, yeah. Natural born. But I don't think it's explicit. But there is a naturalization clause that directs the legislature to handle that with laws. So it's a generational thing. Sir?
So we learned a couple of years ago from Brian that we have something called the Constitution, and then there's Conan, the annotated Constitution, that the Supreme Court now has a Constitution of about 3,000 pages.
Great.
Which one is it that you're taking the oath to? Because what we're learning is that's not it anymore. They've annotated the Constitution to make new laws.
The Constitution can only be annotated through an amendment. And the amendments have a very rigorous passage requirement with both Congress and 2/3 of the legislatures of the various states. So I really don't know what you're referring to, but if it's judicial notation for interpreting the Constitution, I think that's something that the courts use, but that's not what officers of the executive branch swear an oath to. We swear an oath to the Constitution that is written right there.
That's a judgment based on a previous judgment. A judgment based on a previous judgment.
Well, there is case law from the Supreme Court that is maintained over time And those precedents from case law influence how the justices rule on issues as they come up and how federal district courts rule on cases. But it's not changing the Constitution. That's only through amendments. That's my understanding. If anyone has better information, sing out. Sir?
Well, I thought it was rather clear, I guess it was a year ago or 2 years ago, when Brian explained how the Constitution, even though it hasn't been amended, it's been interpreted as law, and that is a lot of interpretation.
Yeah, but that's not the Constitution. That's case law from the courts. And those can be overturned. I mean, I'll give you an example. Oliver Wendell Holmes, I mentioned earlier, concurred with the Virginia legislature movement to place a woman in a mental institution in the 1890s and sterilize her because they didn't, Wendell Holmes said, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And they sterilized the woman against her will, put her in an insane asylum. Now, does that create inviolable precedent in the Constitution because that was a Supreme Court ruling? No, it does not. Each generation has its own set of mores and social responsibility. They interpret those things in that era. But it all goes back to the basic founding document of the Constitution, the articles therein. It doesn't get changed by case law unless there's an amendment. Okay?
We're probably just about out of time.
Okay.
Maybe one more question.
One more?
I ran the trivia contest the other day, and one of the questions I thought was very interesting, it said, what powers does the president have to amend the Constitution? Absolutely zero. So whoever it is, they can mess with that.
That's right. That's very, very clear.
I figured out who's smart enough to change our founding fathers' words. I haven't found a person.
Yes, sir. Last one.
Just on the case of the U.S. citizen that was drone struck, fellow CSU graduate.
What do you guys drink over there?
Well, we'll get into that later. We'll show you. So what is the rationale on that? That he was overseas, he couldn't be extradited? I mean, it seems like a pretty extreme case that you would drone strike a U.S. citizen just because of his geography. Had he been in Key West, Florida, would have he suffered the same fate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if he would have suffered a different fate if he was in the continental United States or under the jurisdiction of the United States borders. But I think clear and present danger clause was leaned on this particular decision, that he could cause more harm immediately because the shoe bomber influence that he fostered could have killed 300 people on an airplane. So when was the next time he was going to influence somebody to take a terrorist attack like that? And he was admittedly Al-Qaeda's chief propagandist. So he painted himself as an active threat to the United States. So I think the administration made a decision at that time, and the Attorney General approved it, that he was a clear and present danger and needed to be taken out, and he waived his rights as a U.S. citizen when he started fighting against our nation. That's my understanding.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick, and a big round of applause for this great intelligence fellow.